Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The Caldwell Grand Ballroom, on the night of the Autumn Masquerade, was the most beautiful cage London had ever built. 300 candles burned in crystal chandeliers overhead, their flames trembling like nervous hearts. The marble floor shone so white that every dancer seemed to float above their own reflection. Silk gowns swept the ground in rivers of gold, sapphire, and wine red. The violins played something lush and slow, the kind of music that made people forget their cruelty for exactly 3 minutes at a time. Duchess Arabella Voss stood near the east archway, her black gown stark against the gold wallpaper, a single pearl at her throat catching the candlelight. She was not dancing, she was watching. That was always how Arabella survived beautiful rooms. She watched until the room showed her its teeth. She had almost decided to leave. She had kissed the cheek of Lady Portmore at the entrance, nodded to 3 foreign diplomats near the punch table, and refused 2 invitations to waltz. Her carriage was already waiting in the courtyard below, her driver stamping his boots against the cold November cobblestones. Arabella's gloved hand rested on the balustrade at the edge of the stairs. She was calculating the exact number of steps it would take to reach the door without being stopped, when the music lurched to a halt so suddenly it felt like a bone had snapped. 300 faces turned toward the grand staircase in the North Hall. The sound that followed was something no one in that room had ever heard before. Not in any ballroom, not in any drawing room, not in 20 years of London seasons. It was a man's voice, raw and ragged with terror, stripped of every polished layer that rank and title usually demanded. "Arabella, please, Arabella, save me." His voice cracked on her name, like glass dropped on stone. Duke Emilian Crest stood at the top of the grand staircase, and he was shaking. His white cravat hung loose at his throat. His dark evening coat was pulled at the shoulder, as though someone had grabbed him roughly, and he had only just broken free. His hair, always so immaculately combed in the portraits that hung in every salon from Mayfair to Edinburgh, was disheveled, falling across his forehead in damp, dark strands. But the most alarming thing, the detail that made the Countess of Hartwell press her fan to her mouth and the youngest Beaumont daughter grip her mother's arm, was this. Duke Emilian Crest was crying, not quietly, not the polite, controlled sort of grief a man of his station might permit himself at a funeral. His shoulders were heaving, tears ran openly down his jaw. He was searching the crowd with frantic, reddened eyes, and he had just screamed her name in front of all of London's finest. Arabella did not move for 3 full seconds. She counted them the way she counted everything, deliberately, like a woman who had learned that acting too quickly was just another form of panic. The crowd between them was a forest of silk and frozen expressions. She saw Lady Seraphine Dallow standing 10 feet from the foot of the staircase, her jaw carved into a smile that had nothing to do with warmth. She saw Lord Bastian Thorne, Seraphine's constant companion, materialize from the shadow of a doorway, his black eyes fixed on Emilian with an expression that was not concern, it was calculation. The room was holding its breath, waiting to see what the Duchess would do. Arabella lifted her chin. She straightened her spine, and then she walked toward the staircase, not rushing, not stumbling, but with the focused, unshakable stride of a woman who had already decided the outcome of everything that came next. She reached the bottom step, just as Emilian's legs buckled. He caught the brass railing with one white-knuckled hand, and for a terrible moment it looked as though the Duke of Crest was going to collapse on the most famous staircase in London. Arabella took the stairs 2 at a time. Her hand found his arm before he fell. She felt the trembling in him, deep, violent, the kind of shaking that lives in the bones, not the skin. "I have you," she said quietly, so only he could hear. His red eyes found hers, and she saw something in them that she had not expected. It wasn't just terror. It wasn't just desperation. It was the look of a man who had been drowning for a very long time, and had only now allowed himself to believe that someone might be close enough to pull him out. Below them, the 300 guests of the Caldwell Autumn Masquerade stood utterly still, their masks pushed back, their faces bare with shock and hunger for what would happen next. Arabella did not look at them. She looked only at Emelian. There is a kind of knowing that belongs only to childhood, the deep animal recognition of another person that forms before the world teaches you to be careful. Arabella Voss had known Emelian Crest since she was 7 years old, and he was 9, in the summer when the 2 great Valemore estates shared a crumbling stone wall that neither family had bothered to repair. She had first seen him sitting on top of that wall, his trouser knees dirty, his face tipped up at the summer sky as though he were personally offended by the clouds. She had thrown an apple core at him to get his attention, and he had looked down at her with such complete astonishment that she had laughed so hard she fell into the lavender bushes. That was where it began. In dirt and laughter and the safe, careless world that existed before titles meant anything. They had spent 4 summers building a language between them. Coded knocks on the wall, a system of chalk marks on the gatepost that meant everything from "I'm bored" to "come immediately," to "my tutor is coming, but sneak over anyway." Emelian had been a quiet boy, the kind who felt things so deeply. He seemed sometimes to carry the world's weight in his slight, serious shoulders. His father, the old Duke of Crest, was a man of cold silences and colder expectations. His mother had died when he was 6. There was no one in Emelian's house who laughed at breakfast or left books open on the garden bench. And so he climbed the wall and found Arabella, and Arabella, who had 3 older brothers who never let her finish a sentence, found in Emelian the rarest gift a child can receive, someone who listened. He remembered everything she told him, every small, seemingly unimportant thing. When Arabella was 15 and Emelian 17, their families had declared the friendship unsuitable. Her father had called it an impractical attachment. His father had called it something worse. They were separated with the efficient brutality of aristocratic parents who believed that emotion was a social liability. Arabella had cried exactly once in her own wardrobe, alone with a pillow pressed to her face. And then she had packed the feeling away like something breakable, put it in the back of the mental room where she kept things she could not afford to feel in public. She had grown up. She had married a good man, the steady and kind Duke Reginald Voss, who had died of fever 3 years ago and left her with a title, an estate, and a grief so clean and true that it had taught her what love without games looked like. She had not heard Emelian's name spoken in nearly 15 years. Until 8 weeks ago. His letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped inside a parcel of books from the Valemore Lending Library, as though it were an afterthought, as though he had hidden it on purpose among things she might not immediately inspect. The letter was short, 3 sentences. The handwriting was Emelian's, but it trembled in a way she did not recognize. "I am not well. I am not free. Please don't answer this letter unless you mean to help." She had read it 6 times. She had folded it carefully and placed it beneath her writing desk, and then she had sat very still in the slant of morning light for a long time, turning over those 3 sentences the way you turn a stone to see what lives beneath it. Not well, not free. The words had not left her since. She had written back. Of course she had written back. She had asked a single, precise question, "What do you need?" His answer had come 4 days later, again tucked inside a delivery. This time, an arrangement of white roses sent to the wrong name at her address, a trick so careful it told her volumes about how closely he was being watched. His answer was not an answer at all. It was a warning. "Don't come to Crest House. Don't ask anyone about me. If you come to the Caldwell Ball next Thursday, I will find a way to reach you. If you don't come, assume that I could not." Arabella had asked her lady's maid Petra to lay out the black gown for Thursday evening. She had not told Petra why. She had spent the days between waiting with a patience so perfect that it looked like calm, though it was the exact opposite. It was controlled so tight that it trembled, like a bridge bearing more weight than it was designed to hold. Now, standing beside Emelian on the staircase of the Caldwell ballroom, his arm shaking beneath her hand, and 300 pairs of eyes boring into their backs, Arabella understood something that the letter had only hinted at. This was not a private struggle. This was a man who had been pushed past every socially acceptable breaking point until the only thing left was the rawest possible cry for help. He had screamed her name in front of all of London, and that single fact told her more than any letter could. Whatever was happening to Emilian Crest, it was not something he could solve quietly, carefully, or alone. It had already escaped the bounds of discretion. It was already bleeding into the open, and the woman standing at the foot of those stairs, the one with the carved smile and the diamond choker, had not moved an inch. She was watching, waiting, and she did not look afraid. Arabella guided Emilian firmly toward the small drawing-room off the upper landing. She did not hurry. She did not let anyone see her hands tighten on his arm as he stumbled on the second step. She kept her face composed, the way she had kept it composed at her husband's funeral, at the reading of his will. At every moment, the world had demanded that she feel nothing in public. Behind her, she heard the slow, reluctant restart of the violins. She heard the rustle of 300 guests pretending to go back to dancing, while every single one of them watched from the corners of their eyes. She heard, just barely, at the edge of perception, the sound of Lady Seraphine Dallow's soft, deliberate footsteps beginning to follow. Arabella did not turn around. She pressed her palm flat against the drawing-room door and pushed it open, and pulled Emilian inside and closed it behind them, both with a quiet, final click. The drawing-room was small and unlit, smelling of cold fireplace ash and old paper. Through the door, they could hear the muffled, polite noise of the ball reassembling itself, the violins finding their place again, the shuffling dance of social pretense resuming. In here, there was only the thin silver light from the tall window and Emilian's ragged breathing. Arabella found a candle on the mantelpiece and used the small tinderbox beside it without asking permission. This was not the time for asking permission. The flame caught, and the room came up in warm, unsteady gold. She turned to look at him properly for the first time in 15 years. He had grown into his face. The boy's sharp cheekbones had settled into something more measured. He was tall now, in the way that men who carry tension become tall, pulled upward by it. But his eyes, even red-rimmed and wet, were exactly the same. Dark brown, precise, seeing everything. "Sit down," she said, not unkindly, just cleanly. He sat on the edge of a low brocade chair, as though he didn't trust it to hold him. She remained standing. It was easier to think standing. "How long?" she asked. He knew what she meant. He pressed his palms against his knees and looked at the floor. "Since April." 7 months. The word landed between them like something dropped from a great height. She watched his hands on his knees, how still he was trying to be, how badly he was failing, and filed the detail away. A man of his control did not shake like this from 7 months of ordinary trouble. This was deeper. This was the shake that came from being held inside something for so long that the body forgot what it felt like to be free. She pulled the other chair close and sat down across from him, close enough that he could see her face clearly in the candlelight. "Tell me from the beginning," she said. "Not the polished version, the real one." He closed his eyes. For a moment, she thought he might not manage it. Then he began. It had started with a debt. His father, the old Duke, who had died in February, had left the Crest estate in a state that even Emilian, who had known his father was reckless, had not anticipated. The figure was enormous, enough to sink a dukedom, enough to strip the houses, the land, the paintings off the walls, and the silver off the table, and still leave something unpaid. He had been sitting with his solicitor in the cold front office of Crest House, staring at numbers that refused to rearrange themselves into anything survivable, when Lady Seraphine Dallow had arrived, uninvited, unannounced, with a leather portfolio under her arm and a smile like a sealed envelope. Lady Seraphine Dallow was 34 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of a fortune that was, by every reliable account, obscene. She had come from the merchant class. Her late husband had built his money in shipping and trade, and she had spent the 8 years of her marriage learning how to pass for something higher. She was good at it now. She wore the right gloves, used the right words, held her fork with practiced precision. But there was something behind the performance, a hard, acquisitive quality that the best drawing rooms in London had learned to sense without being able to name. She had sat down across from Emilian in his ruined office without being asked, and had laid her portfolio open on the desk between them. She had spoken for exactly 12 minutes. At the end of 12 minutes, she had offered to purchase every Crested in full in exchange for a betrothal contract, signed within 48 hours, with a quiet wedding to follow before spring. "And you signed it," Arabella said. Her voice carried no judgment, just the precision of someone assembling facts. Emilian opened his eyes. "I signed it." He said it the way a man confesses something he has spent months trying to forgive himself for. There were 47 tenants on the Crest estate, 47 families in houses that would have been sold from under them if I had refused. There were 300 acres of agricultural land that would have been parceled out to speculators. My father's staff, some of whom had been there since before I was born, would have been on the street by March. He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. I told myself it was temporary, that I would find another solution, that I had time. Arabella looked at him steadily. "And then you discovered there was no other solution," he nodded, "and that she knew it before she sat down." The worst part came next, and Emilian told it in fragments, the way people recount things that their minds are still trying to make bearable. In the months since signing, Seraphine had not behaved like a woman who had entered a business arrangement. She had behaved like a woman who had purchased something and intended to make absolute use of it. She moved through Crest House as though she already owned it, rearranging staff, dismissing servants who had been there for decades, limiting who Emilian could see and when. She read his correspondence. Not secretly, she was past pretending. She simply informed him, one Tuesday morning over breakfast, that all letters arriving at the house would pass through her first. When he had objected, she had reminded him that the signed contract gave her, through a legal clause he had not noticed in the exhaustion of that first meeting, authority over the estate management pending the wedding date. She had his signature on a document that was 1 part rescue and 3 parts trap. Arabella sat quietly for a moment after he finished. The candle between them had burned down an inch. From beyond the door, the faint 3/4 rhythm of the waltz continued, oblivious. She thought about the chalk marks on the garden wall. She thought about the way he had sat on that crumbling stone as a boy, face turned to the sky, and she had known even then, even at 7 years old, that he felt things too deeply for the world he had been born into. She had always known. She had simply stopped paying attention. "Who else knows?" she asked. "No one," he said. "I tried to tell my solicitor, and he was dismissed the next day. I wrote to my cousin in Edinburgh. The letter never arrived. Tonight was the first time He stopped, looked at the floor. "I didn't plan it. I saw you standing at the balustrade and something, I don't know what." "You didn't plan it," she agreed quietly. She stood up. "That's actually better." She moved to the window and looked down at the courtyard below. Her carriage was still there. Good. She would need it. Arabella had made one rule for herself after her husband died, a rule she had never spoken aloud, but had kept faithfully for 3 years. She would not enter a fight she had not first fully mapped. She had watched too many brilliant people charge at problems with good intentions and bad information and come out the other side broken. Grief had taught her many things, but the sharpest lesson was this: the most dangerous adversaries were not the ones who were obviously cruel. They were the ones who were organized. She stood at the window of the small, dark drawing-room and looked at the garden below, and she began to think, not emotionally, not yet. First, she would think the way a military engineer thought about a wall. Where were the weaknesses? Where was the load-bearing structure? What would happen to the whole if you removed the correct single stone? Lady Seraphine Dallow was not a fool. That much was already clear. She turned back to Emilian. "The contract," she said. "Do you still have a copy?" "Seraphine has both signed copies. She took mine the morning after I signed it." Arabella paused. Did you read it fully before you signed? He hesitated. I read most of it. She recognized the particular shame in his pause, the shame of a man who had been too desperate and too sleep-deprived and too devastated by grief to read every line of a document placed in front of him at the worst moment of his adult life. She did not say, "How could you?" She said, "That's not important now. What matters is that the clause giving her estate management authority, what exactly did she say it covered?" He described it as best he could. The clause, as Emelian remembered it, granted her power over estate decisions pending marriage. But it was the word pending that interested Arabella. Pending could mean many things. It could also be dismantled. "I need the name of your solicitor," she said, not the one she dismissed, the one before him, the one who handled your father's estate originally. Emelian blinked. "Wickham. Theodore Wickham. He retired to Bath 2 years ago." Is he retired, or was he retired? Emelian went still. He understood the distinction immediately. I assumed he retired. Father mentioned it, but looking back, the timing. Was it before or after your father began accumulating the debt? Silence. Then, after. Arabella nodded slowly. Pieces were beginning to arrange themselves in the specific way that meant she was close to something real. If Seraphine had been watching the Crest Estate's decline long enough to position herself perfectly for the moment after the old Duke's death, then the story didn't start in April. The story started much earlier, and that meant there was a paper trail that Seraphine believed no longer existed. Paper trails were Arabella's particular expertise. She had spent the 3 years of her widowhood doing something most duchesses did not do. She had learned her estate's finances with the rigor of an accountant, not because it was expected, no one expected it, but because she had found, in the meticulous world of ledgers and contracts, a kind of clarity that society never offered. She understood title deeds and debt instruments and the quiet, grinding machinery of entailed property. She had 4 solicitors who were loyal to her specifically because she paid them well, treated them respectfully, and never, under any circumstances, allowed anyone else access to her correspondence. She also had one advantage that Seraphine had likely not calculated. Arabella moved through London as a widow, which meant that society paid her just enough attention to be useful and not enough to be dangerous. She was the woman in black by the archway, whom men didn't ask to dance. That made her extremely mobile. "I need you to do something very difficult," she said to Emelian. "I need you to go back out there." He looked at her as though she had suggested he walk into a fire. "Back to the ballroom?" "Yes. You need to be seen. You need to let everyone assume that whatever just happened on the staircase was a moment of overwrought emotion. Too much wine, some personal grief, a temporary embarrassment that the Duke of Crest has now recovered from. Let Seraphine believe that I turned you away, that I spoke to you briefly, and left." His jaw tightened. "And what will you actually be doing?" "Looking for Theodore Wickham's replacement," she said, "and having a very quiet word with 3 people in this building who I believe know more about your finances than you do." She watched his face move through fear and shame and something at the back, something stubborn and old and long buried, that looked, very quietly, like trust. She gathered her gloves from the chair where they had slid off unnoticed. "When you go back out, do not look at me. Do not acknowledge me. If Seraphine approaches you, smile. Tell her I offered you a glass of water and some platitudes about the pressures of social life. Be boring, be embarrassed. Let her believe she has already won this evening." Emelian stood. He straightened his cravat with hands that only shook a little now. He looked at her in the candlelight, and she saw the boy on the wall again, briefly, the way a figure appears for a moment in the fog before it vanishes back into the white. "Arabella," she waited. "I am sorry," he said, "for the scene, for all of it. I don't know what—" "Don't apologize," she said. "You did the right thing. The only problem with screaming for help is doing it too quietly." The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close. She opened the drawing-room door herself. The noise of the ball rushed back in, warm, glittering, entirely indifferent. She let him pass through first, waited 30 seconds, and then followed. She moved left. He moved right. By the time she reached the edge of the south gallery, she had already located 3 of the people she needed to find before the evening ended. The first was Harold Penfold, a discreet but formidable financial solicitor who had handled half the property transfers in Mayfair for 20 years and owed Arabella a significant favor she had never yet collected. The second was Margaret Alden, the Caldwell housekeeper's niece, who had worked briefly at Crest House before being let go in what Emilian had described as a staff reduction. And the third, the one Arabella looked at last, from across the room, with the full weight of her attention, was Lady Seraphine Dallow, who was watching Emilian from behind a champagne glass with the composed, hungry patience of someone who had laid a trap and was now simply waiting for the mechanism to complete its work. The morning after the Caldwell ball was gray and cold, the kind of November dawn that arrives without ceremony, just a slow leak of pale light through curtains the color of old linen. Arabella was already dressed by 5. She had not slept, not for the usual reasons, not from anxiety, but because her mind had been working through the night, like a room being rearranged, furniture moved quietly and precisely in the dark. By the time Petra arrived with the tea tray at 5:30, Arabella was already at her writing desk with 3 separate pieces of paper spread before her, and a list she had been building since 2 in the morning. The list had 14 items on it. She had already crossed off 4. She circled the 5th. Theodore Wickham, Bath, retired solicitor, Crest Estate Original Counsel. She dipped her pen. She wrote the letter fast, without pausing to consider the phrasing, the way she wrote whenever instinct was ahead of thought. Harold Penfold came to her at 10. He was a small, careful man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the cautious manner of someone who had spent a career knowing things he was never supposed to say aloud. She had retrieved him from the card-room last night and spoken to him for exactly 9 minutes in the corridor outside the cloakroom, enough to ask the right questions, not enough to be observed. He arrived at her house on Grosvenor Street carrying a plain leather case and the expression of a man who had not slept either, and was not sure if that was good or bad. She brought him directly to the study. No tea, no pleasantries. She set her list on the desk between them. "I need to know," she said, "whether a contract like this—" She described the terms as Emilian had given them: the debt purchase, the betrothal agreement, the estate management clause. "Has any flaw that would make it voidable under current property law?" Harold took off his spectacles, polished them, put them back on. Then he said quietly, "That depends on something." "The clause granting estate management authority prior to marriage," Harold said, "is only valid if the signatory was in full legal capacity at the time of signing. If there is any evidence that the contract was signed under duress, financial, emotional, or through deliberate concealment of material terms, it becomes challengeable." He paused. "It also depends on the jurisdiction in which the debt instruments were originally issued. If the original debts were registered under certain commercial statutes, the purchase of those debts by a private individual, rather than a licensed financial institution, may itself be legally irregular." Arabella felt the particular clarity that came when you had been looking at a wall for a long time and suddenly saw the door. She leaned forward. And if the individual who purchased those debts had known in advance that the estate would reach that point of crisis, if there was evidence of deliberate engineering of the financial situation— Harold went very still. "Then it would not be a debt purchase at all," he said slowly. "It would be fraud." The word sat between them with the clean, solid weight of something accurate. Arabella looked at her list. She drew a line through Harold Penfold's name and moved to the next one. Margaret Alden had not been difficult to find. She was in service now at a household in Bloomsbury, and Arabella's note had reached her by 11. She arrived at the Grosvenor Street house at noon, still in her service coat, looking surprised to be received in the front parlor rather than the back. She was 26, with a direct, observant face, and the particularly careful stillness of a woman who has learned to watch those above her without appearing to. She sat on the edge of the offered chair and looked at Arabella with a wariness that slowly, as Arabella explained simply and clearly that no one was in any trouble and that anything she shared would remain private, began to soften. Margaret had worked at Crest House for 7 weeks before being let go in June. During those 7 weeks, she had, among other duties, assisted the senior housekeeper in maintaining the household inventory records. She had, on 2 occasions, been asked to sort and file incoming correspondence in the estate office, and on one afternoon in early June, she had been sent to the cellar to retrieve wine for a dinner, had taken a wrong door, and had found herself not in the wine cellar, but in the estate's old records room, a room that, she noted carefully, showed recent signs of having been gone through. Documents in disarray, one file cabinet partially emptied, a smell of burning paper that she had assumed was from the adjacent kitchen chimney, until she noticed a brass-edged fireplace grate in the corner of the records room that had been recently used, and tucked beneath the grate, because one sheet had caught on the brass teeth and not quite fallen into the ash, was the corner of a document. She had not known what it was, she had left it, but she remembered exactly where. Arabella thanked Margaret with a composure that required considerable effort. She paid her a fair sum for her time and discretion, and sent her back to Bloomsbury in Arabella's own carriage. Then she sat alone in her parlor for 60 seconds, with her hands flat on her knees, breathing slowly. A partially burned document in the Crest Estate Records Room, and Seraphine had been inside Crest House since April. If something had been deliberately destroyed, it had been destroyed to remove evidence of something that predated April. But if one corner had survived, caught on the grate teeth, preserved by accident, and the specific shape of a brass fireplace surround, then there was still something to find. She went back to her desk. She wrote a second letter to Theodore Wickham in Bath, this time more specific. And then she wrote a third letter, this one to Emilian, disguised as a note from a book dealer, with a single instruction hidden inside the billing. Address: go to the records room, find the grate. Don't touch anything. Tell me what you see. Petra delivered the letter personally, on foot, not by post, before the afternoon light failed. Arabella stood at her window, watching the sky turn the color of old pewter over the London rooftops. She thought about Seraphine standing at the foot of the staircase last night. That stillness, that smile. She thought about the specific kind of confidence that smile carried. It was the confidence of someone who believed they had removed every obstacle, who had prepared for every contingency except one. Because Seraphine had never met Arabella. Not really. She had seen the widow in black by the archway, the woman who didn't dance. She had seen what society saw, a quiet, unremarkable presence in a room of glittering people. She had not seen, could not have known to look for, the 14-item list, the 3 letters, the network of quiet loyalties that Arabella had been building for 3 years since her husband died, and left her, for the first time in her life, with both the time and the authority to become something no one expected her to be. By dusk, Seraphine answered without writing a word. Arabella saw it first in the street below, the same black-lacquered carriage turning twice past Grosvenor Street, never stopping, never hurrying, its curtains drawn though no rain fell. Petra returned through the kitchen entrance with mud on the hem of her cloak and a white line around her mouth. A man had followed her from Bond Street to the bookseller's lane, close enough that she could hear the silver head of his cane strike the pavement. He had said only one sentence as he passed her: "Tell your mistress widows can still be ruined." Then he had vanished into the fog. Petra repeated the words exactly. Arabella listened, folded the warning into the same mental drawer where she kept useful facts, and asked whether Petra had been frightened. "Yes, Your Grace," Petra said. "Good," Arabella replied. "Then we will be careful, not quiet." That night, Arabella found another message waiting on her hall table, delivered by a boy who had been paid too much to remember who had sent him. The paper was blank, except for a pressed white rose, its stem snapped clean in 2. It was an elegant threat, almost pretty, and for that reason more contemptible. Arabella held the broken flower over the fire until the petals blackened and curled. Seraphine had made her first mistake. She had stopped being merely organized and had become personal. Organized enemies could be mapped. Personal enemies could be made impatient. Arabella needed Seraphine impatient. Emilian did not sleep either. He lay in his bed in Crest House, his family's house, for 6 generations, though it had not felt like his since April, and stared at the ceiling plasterwork he had memorized as a child. When he was small, he had named the shapes in the plaster, a horse, a river, a figure that might have been a woman walking. He found himself looking for them now in the dark, the way people in pain reach for childhood things without thinking. The horse was still there, the river, the walking woman. He was 32 years old, Duke of Crest, educated at Oxford, holder of one of the oldest titles in England, and he was lying in the dark, looking at shapes in the ceiling plaster for the same reason a child does, because everything else was too large and too frightening, and the plaster shapes were exactly what they had always been. Seraphine had come to him after the ball. He had been in the hall removing his coat when she appeared from the drawing-room off the east corridor, still in her gown, her diamond choker catching the hallway lamp. She was not angry. That was the worst thing about her. She was never angry. Anger could be navigated. Anger had edges you could find and work around. Seraphine had no edges. She moved through every situation with the same pleasant, composed, lethal smoothness of someone who had thought so many steps ahead that your response had already been accounted for and catalogued and rendered irrelevant. She had said, in the tone of someone discussing the weather, "That was unfortunate, but recoverable." Then she had looked at him with those precise, assessing eyes and said, "Your old friend, the Duchess. She won't help you, you know. She won't risk her reputation for something this untidy." Emelian had said nothing. That was the safest thing he could do, and he was becoming expert at safety. In the morning, a letter arrived, tucked inside a book delivery, from a dealer he didn't recognize, with an address he almost discarded. He read it twice before he understood the instruction embedded in the billing details. The records room, the grate. He waited until Seraphine left for a luncheon in Belgravia. He watched her carriage leave from the upstairs window, and then he waited an additional 15 minutes, because she had done it twice before, left and returned within minutes with some invented errand that he was now certain was a test. When 15 minutes produced nothing, he went downstairs, past the kitchen, through the back corridor, into the records room he had not entered since before his father died, because his father had kept it locked, and the habit of not entering had persisted. The room smelled of damp and old paper, and something faintly chemical, camphor or something like it. It was cold. The light came from one small window, set high in the wall, iron-barred, looking out at the base of the garden hedge. The file cabinets stood along the far wall, 3 of them, and even in the dim gray light, Emelian could see that they had been opened and reorganized. Folders sat at wrong angles. Certain drawers were overfull where they had once been sparse. Someone had sorted through this room quickly and with an agenda. The fireplace grate was in the near left corner, small and old, the kind used in working rooms rather than formal spaces, more function than ornament. He crouched before it. The ash was cold, weeks old from the look of it. He could see, as he leaned in, that the burning had been thorough. Whatever had been in here, it had been reduced carefully to powder and fragments. But Margaret's memory had been accurate. The brass teeth of the grate's lower rail had caught something. A single corner of paper, perhaps 4 inches by 3, blackened at its edges, fragile as a moth's wing but intact. He did not touch it. He leaned close in the thin light and read what was visible on the preserved corner. The handwriting was his father's. He recognized it immediately. The heavy, slightly lurching hand of a man who wrote infrequently, and always with too much pressure. What was visible were the end of a date. Ember 1871. 3 words, mid-sentence. To Dallow through. And at the very bottom, the clear, complete signature of Theodore Wickham, solicitor, with his stamp. The document predated his father's death by over 2 years. It predated Seraphine's arrival by over 2 years. His father had known her. His father had done something with her, and whatever it was, she had come back to collect. He stood up. He was shaking again, not the desperate shaking of the ballroom, but a different kind, colder, more specific, the kind that comes not from fear, but from the moment when the worst thing you suspected turns out to be true, and the truth is not a relief, but simply a heavier, cleaner version of the weight you were already carrying. He thought of his father, the silences, the cold distance, the debts. He thought about all the months he had blamed his own insufficient loyalty, his absence at university, his failure to come home sooner. He had been carrying guilt for a ruined estate and a dead father, and he had never once considered that the ruin had been arranged from outside, that someone had been eating at the walls long before he arrived to find them crumbling. He went to his own study and sat down. He wrote one word on a piece of paper, folded it, and placed it inside the next book delivery going out that afternoon. The word was found. For the first time since April, Emelian did not wait to be managed. He rang for Mrs. Vale, the oldest remaining housekeeper at Crest House, and asked her to bring 2 footmen she trusted more than she feared. When they arrived, he did not explain everything. He explained enough. The records room door was to be locked from the outside and watched. No papers were to be moved, burned, swept, or touched. If Lady Seraphine or Lord Bastian asked for entry, they were to be told the Duke had ordered repairs to the chimney and possessed the only key. His voice shook on the first sentence, then steadied on the second. By the third, the servants were looking at him not as a sick man or a trapped man, but as their master returned to his own threshold. Lord Bastian came within the hour. He arrived with 2 men from Seraphine's household and a smile that was too practiced to be casual. Lady Dallow requires access to the old files, he said, extending one gloved hand as though the key already belonged in it. Emelian stood between him and the corridor, leading down to the records room. He could feel his pulse beating in his throat, could feel the old fear gathering, but fear, he discovered, did not have to be obeyed. Lady Dallow may require whatever she likes, he said. This is Crest House. The key remains with me. Bastian's smile thinned. The footman behind Emelian did not move. After a long, ugly pause, Bastian bowed and left. Only when the front door closed did Emelian realize that his hands were no longer shaking. Seraphine returned from her luncheon at 3 in the afternoon, looking satisfied, in the specific way that told him she had spent the hours managing something he didn't know about. She informed him over tea that the wedding date had been set. She had already spoken with the Grosvenor Chapel about the first Saturday in December, and that she had taken the liberty of informing certain mutual acquaintances so that the announcement would be a confirmation rather than a surprise. She said this pleasantly. She poured his tea for him and pushed it across the table with a smile that he now knew, with cold and absolute clarity, had been calculated years before he ever sat down across from it. He lifted the cup. He smiled back. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done, and he was only able to do it because somewhere across the city, in a house on Grosvenor Street, a woman with 14 items on a list and 3 years of quiet preparation had written the word found and underlined it twice. Theodore Wickham's response arrived on the 4th day. Arabella had expected to wait longer. The fact that it arrived quickly, within 48 hours of her second letter, told her something significant about the old solicitor's state of mind. Either he had been waiting for someone to ask, or he had been afraid of exactly this question and wanted to answer it before anyone else did. The letter was long. It was written in the careful, slightly cramped hand of a man who had spent a lifetime being precise and was choosing, for perhaps the first time, to be something else, honest. Arabella read it at her desk in one sitting. She did not look up. She did not mark her place. She held the pages with both hands and read every word, including the postscript, and when she finished, she set the letter down on the desk and sat very still with her palms flat against the leather surface, pressing down the way you press down in something that might otherwise fly apart. Wickham wrote that he had been the Crest family solicitor for 19 years, that in the summer of 1871 he had been approached by a business intermediary, a Mr. Rowan Dallow he now believed, in hindsight, to have been Lady Seraphine's late husband or an agent acting on his behalf, about a series of investment arrangements that the old Duke of Crest had been presented with as extraordinary opportunities. The arrangements had been structured to appear profitable in the short term and disastrous in the long term, with the disaster delayed precisely long enough that the connection to the original arrangement would not be apparent. Wickham had advised against them. The old Duke had ignored his advice. When Wickham had persisted, had put his concerns in writing, he had been dismissed, not personally by the Duke, but through a letter from a new solicitor Wickham had never met, citing a conflict of interest that Wickham had never been given the opportunity to address. The retirement to Bath had not been voluntary. He had been, in all but legal name, removed, and because the person who removed him was the Duke of Crest, because the authority had come from the right name on the right letterhead, there was nothing Wickham had been able to challenge. He had gone to Bath. He had spent 2 years writing a careful, thorough account of everything he had witnessed, including dates, names, amounts, and the specific language of the investment arrangements. He had kept copies of everything he had been allowed to keep. He had done this, he wrote, in the manner of a man who knows that what he is writing will probably never matter, but who cannot in conscience stop writing it. The account ran to 11 pages. He had enclosed the complete copy with his letter. He asked only one thing of Arabella in his careful postscript. Please use this only if you are certain it will reach the right hands. I am old, he wrote, but I am not finished. Arabella read the enclosed account, all 11 pages. She made 3 notes on a separate sheet. Specific dates, where Wickham's account intersected with public records she could verify independently. Then she placed the documents in the locked drawer of her writing desk and went to find Petra. I need you to go to Bloomsbury, she said, the address I am about to give you. I need you to ask Margaret Alden if she will be willing to provide a signed statement about what she found in the Crest Estate Records room. Petra, who had been Arabella's lady's maid for 6 years, and had therefore witnessed many things that most people would have found inexplicable, simply said, Before dinner or after? Arabella looked at the window. The afternoon light was fading. Before. I'd like to have it tonight, she paused. And Petra. Come the back way, both times. By evening she had 4 things: Wickham's account, Margaret's signed statement, Harold Penfold's legal analysis of the contract, and the word found from Emelian indicating the document fragment in the records room. 4 things. She laid them out on the parlor table after dinner, and looked at them the way a card player looks at a hand, assessing what she had, assessing what was missing, assessing what she needed in order for this to be irrefutable rather than merely suggestive. What she needed was the original document, or enough of it that its content could be reconstructed. The fragment in the grate had a date, 3 words, and Wickham's signature. Wickham's 11-page account could fill in the rest, but she needed to know if Wickham had kept a carbon copy of whatever that original document had been. She wrote to him again that night, her 3rd letter in 4 days. She was aware, writing it, that she was moving faster than was comfortable. But December was 3 weeks away, and the Grosvenor Chapel had already been booked. The 5th thing arrived as proof that Seraphine was beginning to feel the walls shift. Near 9 o'clock, a stone struck the lower library window hard enough to crack the outer pane. Wrapped around it was a scrap of paper, written in a hand that had tried very hard to look like a servant's. Send the woman away, or she will be named. Arabella did not need to ask which woman. Mrs. Frayne had not been in the house 2 hours, and already Seraphine knew. That meant someone had watched the door, or watched Margaret, or watched Petra. It also meant Seraphine was no longer certain the game belonged to her. Arabella carried the paper upstairs herself, and showed it to Mrs. Frayne, not to frighten her, but to give her the dignity of knowing the truth. Mrs. Frayne read it once, went pale, and then said, very quietly, I will still sign whatever you need me to sign. Arabella thought, with a sharp tenderness that surprised her, that courage often entered rooms looking nothing like courage at all. Emelian's reply came before midnight, carried by a stable boy who had hidden it inside the false bottom of a feed account. It contained more than the word found this time. It contained his own signed statement that he had discovered the burned fragment, that he had preserved the records room by ducal order, that Lord Bastian Thorn had attempted to gain access to the files, and that Emelian Crest, in full possession of his title and authority, would testify to all of it before any judge in London. Arabella read the statement twice. Then she smiled for the first time that week. She had not rescued a helpless man. She had reached into the water, and he had remembered how to swim. She was sealing the letter when her parlor door opened, and Petra appeared with a look that Arabella recognized. Not fear, not alarm, but the specifically careful expression that meant something unexpected had arrived. "There is a woman downstairs asking to speak with you," Petra said. "She will not give her name. She says you will know who she is by the fact that she is asking." Arabella set down the sealing wax. She thought for 2 seconds. Then she said, "Show her up." The woman who entered her parlor was perhaps 40, small, with a compressed, watchful face, and the clothes of someone who had once been in decent service and had since come down in circumstances. She stood just inside the door and looked at Arabella, the way people who have been frightened for a long time look at someone they are not entirely sure they can trust. "I worked for Mr. Rowan Dallow," the woman said quietly, without preamble, "before he died, and then for Lady Seraphine for 2 years after." She stopped. "I have a letter. He wrote it before he died. I have been waiting," she said, "for the right person to give it to." Arabella crossed the room and took the woman's hands in both of hers, not dramatically, just steadily, the way you hold something that has come a long way and is close to breaking. "Sit down," she said. She meant it kindly. The woman sat. Her name, it emerged, was Mrs. Odette Frayne. She had been Rowan Dallow's household secretary, the person who had kept his correspondence, organized his papers, managed the invisible infrastructure of a wealthy man's private life. She had kept the letter for 3 years. She had carried it through 2 changes of address and 1 miserable winter in rented rooms because she hadn't known what to do with it and could not bring herself to destroy it. She took it now from inside her coat, folded, slightly worn at the creases, still sealed, and placed it on Arabella's parlor table between the 4 pieces of evidence already laid out there. Arabella looked at it. Then she looked at Mrs. Frayne. "Will you stay," she asked, "while I read it?" Mrs. Frayne looked at her hands. "Yes," she said, "I think I would like to." The letter was dated the 15th of March, 1873, 6 weeks before Rowan Dallow died. It was addressed to no one, not "Dear Sir," or "To whom it may concern," or any of the usual openings of formal correspondence. It began simply, "I am writing this because I cannot stop knowing it." That first line alone told Arabella most of what she needed to understand about the kind of man Rowan Dallow had been at the end. Not a villain with a confident plan, but something more complicated and more pitiful. A man who had done wrong things and was dying with them still inside him, unable to confess openly and unable to be silent. She read slowly. Mrs. Frayne sat across from her with her hands folded and her eyes on the floor, the posture of someone who had been waiting a long time to put something down. Rowan Dallow wrote that the scheme had been Seraphine's design from its beginning. He had brought the money, the merchant fortune, the connections in the shipping trade, the knowledge of how financial instruments could be structured to appear legitimate over many years. She had brought the strategy and the targets. The Crest estate had been one of 4 aristocratic families they had identified as being in recoverable but deteriorating financial positions, wealthy enough in land and title to be worth pursuing, fragile enough in actual capital that the right sequence of bad investments, offered at the right moment by a convincing intermediary, would produce crisis on schedule. He wrote about Theodore Wickham's warning. He wrote, with the unflinching specificity of a man who has nothing left to lose, "We ensured his removal." He wrote about 2 of the other 3 families, names that Arabella recognized, who had entered into similar arrangements and from whom Seraphine had already collected. 2 marriages, 2 fortunes absorbed, both husbands dead now, both deaths attributed to natural causes. She stopped on that last detail, read it again, both husbands dead now. She set the letter down and looked at Mrs. Frayne directly. Did he elaborate on the circumstances of the other deaths? Mrs. Frayne raised her eyes. "Not in the letter," she said carefully. The pause that followed that carefully was, in itself, a form of answer. Arabella nodded once. She made herself continue reading. Rowan wrote that he had married Seraphine believing the scheme was simply clever business. The accumulation of wealth through superior foresight, with a legal veneer he had been willing not to examine too closely. He had only understood the full scope of what he had participated in when the second husband died, and Seraphine had shown no grief whatsoever, but had shown, at the solicitor's office the following morning, remarkable preparedness regarding the paperwork. He had tried, he wrote, to extricate himself. He had spoken to her about stopping. He had woken 3 weeks later with a fever that the doctors found puzzling. He did not write the obvious conclusion. He didn't have to. He wrote instead, "I became ill. I did not recover as expected. I have decided to write this while I still can." He wrote that he believed Emilian Crest was the next and possibly final target in Seraphine's design. Final, because the Crest title and land were the most valuable of the four, and because after this one, Seraphine would have enough consolidated wealth and social position to be completely untouchable. He wrote, "If there is anyone reading this who can stop her before December, please stop her before December." He had written December even 3 years earlier, which meant he had known the schedule from the beginning. The wedding at the Grosvenor Chapel had been planned from before Emilian's father was even dead. Arabella put the letter down on the table next to Wickham's account, next to Margaret's statement, next to Harold's legal analysis. She looked at Mrs. Frayne. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping this, for coming." Mrs. Frayne nodded. She looked lighter, not happy. The word didn't fit the circumstance, but lighter in the specific way of someone who has set down a physical burden they have been carrying so long they had stopped feeling its weight and only knew its absence when it was gone. Arabella called Petra and arranged for Mrs. Frayne to be given a room in the house for the night, not the staff rooms, the proper guest room, and ensured she had supper and was not left alone. Then she went back to her desk and sat down and looked at what she had assembled. She had now a paper trail that went back 4 years. She had a deceased man's confession. She had a retired solicitor's corroborated account. She had a signed witness statement about destroyed evidence. She had a legal analysis of the contract's vulnerabilities. And she had, embedded in Rowan Dallow's letter, something that no one in London's legal establishment could ignore if it was laid before them correctly, the names of 2 previous victims, 2 families, 2 dead husbands. She wrote 4 letters in the hour before midnight. The first was to a judge she had met twice at Reginald's professional dinners, a man of known integrity who had made 3 enemies in his career by ruling correctly when ruling incorrectly would have been easier. The second was to Harold Penfold, asking him to prepare a formal legal challenge to the contract for filing first thing Monday morning. The third was to Emilian, inside a different book delivery, with a longer embedded message this time. And the fourth was to Lady Seraphine Dallow herself, short, polite, and impossible to ignore. It read, "Dear Lady Dallow, I believe we have a number of mutual interests to discuss. I would be grateful for your company at tea on Sunday at 3 o'clock. Please do come." There was no threat in the letter, no warning, nothing that could be described afterward as confrontational. It was the most dangerous kind of letter, the kind that required the recipient to arrive in order to find out what was known. Seraphine would come. Arabella was certain of it. Women like Seraphine did not decline invitations that might reveal an opponent's hand. They came to assess, to manage, to smile at close range, and take the measure of what was in the room. She would arrive on Sunday at 3 o'clock with her diamond choker and her calculated composure and her absolute conviction that she was the most prepared person in any room she entered, and she would be wrong. For possibly the first time in her carefully engineered life, she would sit across from someone who had spent the last 6 days not reacting to her, not defending against her, not appealing to her, not pleading with her, but building, quietly and completely, and without a single word of warning, a wall around everything she had spent 4 years constructing. Arabella blew out her desk candle. The room went dark. She could hear the November wind outside the Grosvenor Street windows. She was ready for Sunday. Sunday arrived like a held breath. The sky was white and still, the kind of sky that gives nothing away. Arabella had the parlor arranged carefully, not aggressively, not in any way that announced itself as a confrontation. The fire was lit. The tea tray was set for two. The documents were not visible. She had placed them in the locked drawer of the writing desk in the corner of the room, and she had left the desk unlocked, with the drawer slightly ajar, in the way of something carelessly left. An oversight, not a statement. She was dressed in gray today rather than black, which was intentional. Gray was less final than black. Gray said, "I am listening." She sat in the chair nearest the window, where the light fell across the visitor's chair rather than hers. She had learned that detail from Reginald, who had been, in his quiet way, the best negotiator she had ever watched work. Seraphine arrived at exactly 3. Not a minute early, not a minute late. The punctuality of a woman for whom every moment was an assertion. She was wearing dark green silk with a high collar, and the diamond choker which Arabella now suspected was not merely jewelry but armor of a specific kind, a signal that said, "I have already won, and what I am wearing today reflects that confidence." She accepted tea with a gracious nod and settled into the visitor's chair with the practiced ease of someone who had sat in a great many chairs across from a great many adversaries and found all of them wanting. She looked at Arabella with pleasant, attentive eyes. "How kind of you to invite me," she said. "I confess I was curious about what you might want to discuss." The word curious was perfectly chosen. It said, "I believe you have nothing, but I am willing to hear you try." "I have been thinking about the Duke of Crest," Arabella said simply. "As I imagine you have." Seraphine smiled. "Naturally. A very difficult night for him, publicly speaking. Though I believe such moments pass. People forget, especially when they have a wedding to look forward to." She lifted her teacup. "His emotional investment in you is clearly historical. Sentimental, perhaps. I hope you were able to give him the closure he needed." She said closure the way someone might say, "I know you have nothing, and here is your opportunity to admit it, and we can all proceed accordingly." Arabella looked at her steadily. "I actually wanted to ask you about Rowan." The teacup did not rattle. Seraphine's hand did not tremble. But something behind her eyes, that single, controlled flicker, moved and was gone in less than a second. It was enough. "My late husband," Seraphine said, with perfect evenness. "A sad loss? What specifically did you want to know?" "Only whether you've had occasion lately," Arabella said, "to think about the letters he wrote in the last weeks of his life. Specifically, the one he left with Mrs. Odette Frayne, his household secretary, the one she kept for 3 years. Another flicker. Briefer this time. More controlled, but Arabella had been watching. "I'm not sure I know what you're referring to," Seraphine said. Her voice was unchanged. Only the set of her shoulders had shifted, almost imperceptibly, barely a degree, in the way of someone recalculating. "You also knew Theodore Wickham, I believe," Arabella continued, in the same conversational tone. "Your husband's intermediary introduced him to the Duke of Crest Sr. before Mr. Wickham was removed from the position. He has very clear notes." She paused. "He kept everything." Seraphine set her teacup down. "Arabella." She used the first name deliberately, a claim of equality, of equivalence. "You are a clever woman, and you have clearly spent the last few days being busy. I can see that." She leaned forward slightly. "But what you have to understand is that clever and prepared are not the same thing. I have been prepared for a very long time. I have made very certain arrangements, and I have, in the course of those arrangements, ensured that any challenge to the contract will be met with a counter-challenge filed through 3 separate jurisdictions that will take, at minimum, 2 years to resolve." She smiled. "Emilian will have married me long before the first hearing is scheduled." It was an impressive speech. It was the speech of a woman who had genuinely prepared. Arabella let a moment pass. Then she said quietly, "Not if the contract is invalidated this week." "On what grounds?" Seraphine's voice stayed level, but the pleasantness had gone out of it now like heat out of an abandoned room. "Fraud in the inducement," Arabella said. "Specifically, the deliberate engineering of a financial crisis in order to create the conditions of the contract. Harold Penfold has prepared the filing. It goes before Judge Carew on Tuesday morning." She watched Seraphine's face very carefully. "Judge Carew," she added, "who has read Rowan's letter, all of it, including The sections about Lord and Lady Fenmore and the late Sir Hugh Alderton. Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, a carriage passed on Grosvenor Street. Seraphine sat very still. The stillness, Arabella now understood, of a person who had spent years calculating distances and had just found that every distance was shorter than expected. "You won't use that letter," Seraphine said. The confidence was still there in her voice, but it was thinner now, structural, not genuine. "It would ruin you as much as me. The scandal would ruin the pleasant social arrangement I currently enjoy." "Yes," Arabella said. She kept her voice gentle, not triumphant, just clear. "But I am a widow with a secure title, a fully intact estate, and a husband who taught me that doing the right thing in front of the wrong people is not a cost, it is a choice." She stood. "I have a carriage waiting for you, Lady Dallow. My suggestion is that you use the afternoon to consult your own solicitor about the options available to you before Tuesday. I am told a voluntary dissolution of the contract, prior to legal challenge, carries significantly fewer consequences than a contested fraud proceeding." Seraphine rose slowly. She looked at Arabella with an expression that had shed all its layers now. The pleasantness, the calculation, the performance, and what was underneath was surprisingly plain. Just a woman who had built an architecture of ambition so enormous that she had forgotten to plan for the moment it met something sturdier than it. She said nothing more. She picked up her gloves. She left. The contract was dissolved on a Wednesday, 8 days after the Caldwell ball. It happened in Harold Penfold's offices on Fleet Street, in the presence of 3 solicitors, a notary, and a junior clerk, who would later describe the event to his wife as the quietest dramatic thing he had ever witnessed. Lady Seraphine Dallow sat on one side of the table with her own legal representative, a harried man who had clearly been given very little time to prepare. Emilian Crest sat on the other side. He had been told 2 days prior, by Arabella, in a note tucked inside a book of maps he had no memory of ordering, that it was over. He had not entirely believed it. He believed things carefully now, having learned at significant personal cost that certainty was a luxury. He sat in Harold's office and watched the contract be formally voided and signed over with the particular stillness of a person who is not yet sure if the door that has opened is real or imagined. What made the dissolution possible was not Arabella's evidence alone. It was Emilian's statement, delivered in his own hand and read aloud before the notary, that changed the temperature of the room. He did not speak loudly. He did not accuse theatrically. He simply named what had been done to him, named the attempt to seize the records room, named the servants who had witnessed it, and then placed the key to that room on the table beside the contract. "I was afraid," he said, when Seraphine's solicitor tried to interrupt. "That is not the same as consent." The junior clerk stopped writing for one astonished second. Harold Penfold looked down at his papers to hide the expression on his face. Even Seraphine, for the smallest measurable moment, had nothing ready to say. Seraphine signed without speaking. She had come, Arabella was later told by Harold, with the bearing of someone who had accepted an outcome and was choosing to accept it with control rather than humiliation, which was, in its way, the most honest thing she had done in the entire proceeding. She left without looking at Emilian. The junior clerk opened the door for her. She walked out into the Fleet Street morning and was gone. What happened to her afterward? The quiet withdrawal from the social calendar, the property in the country, the eventual permanent departure from London, happened without drama, without a public confrontation. It was, in the end, the kind of justice that doesn't announce itself, the kind that simply removes a presence from a room and lets the room breathe again. Emilian sat in Harold's office for a long moment after everyone else had gone. Harold was tactful enough to find something urgent to attend to in another room. The junior clerk brought tea. Emilian looked at it for a while without touching it. Then he put his face in his hands, not dramatically, not the way he had shaken on the staircase at the Caldwell ball, but quietly, privately, the way a person cries when no one is watching and there is finally room to feel the weight of what they have been carrying. He sat like that for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he lifted his face, straightened his collar, picked up the tea, and drank it. It was cold. He drank it anyway. There was something in that detail, The deliberate drinking of cold tea in a solicitor's back office on a Wednesday morning. That was more himself than anything he had managed in 7 months. Arabella was not at the signing. She had decided not to be there. Not from modesty. She was not modest about the work she had done, but because she understood, in the way she understood most things about human pride, that the moment of release from something that humiliating needed to be Emelian's alone. If she had been there, the story of this moment would have required her presence to be complete, and his freedom would have been tangled up with her rescue rather than simply, cleanly, wholly his. She wanted him to walk out of Fleet Street into the November cold and feel the air on his face and know that it was over, and that he was himself again, and that no other person needed to be in that moment for it to be real. She gave him 3 days, then she wrote him a letter, a real one, not a note, not a coded instruction, and invited him to call. He came on a Saturday morning. Not the studied, formal call of 2 titled neighbors observing protocol, but the arrival of someone who had been counting the days and was trying not to show it. Petra showed him to the back parlor, the small one, with the garden-facing window, and the low fire, and the 2 chairs that Arabella used when she was not performing, being a duchess, but simply being a person. She was already there. She stood when he came in. They looked at each other across the small, warm room, and the thing that had lived between them for 25 years, the coded chalk marks, and the crumbling wall, and the 15 years of silence, and the 3 desperate letters, and the 8 days of the most purposeful work Arabella had done since taking over her late husband's estate, settled very quietly into something it had perhaps always been trying to become. Not obligation, not rescue, recognition. He said, "I don't know how to thank you." She said, "Then don't try yet." She meant it practically. He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, the kind that comes when the body has been so long without it that it catches the person off guard. It was a good sound. She had not heard him laugh since they were children, and she threw an apple core at him from the garden, and he looked down at her with absolute astonishment. It sounded the same, a little deeper now, but the same. She poured tea, hot tea this time, and they sat in the 2 chairs by the window, and outside the November garden showed the last of its brown leaves against the iron sky. And for the first time in a long time, Arabella did not feel like a woman maintaining composure in the face of a world that had forgotten to consider her. She felt like herself. That was, she thought, the best possible ending. Not a crown, not a victory, just the room exactly warm enough and someone sitting across from you who remembered who you were before you learned to be careful. Months passed, winter deepened, and then slowly, tenderly released its grip. Crest House was restored, not overnight, not without effort, but step by careful step, with Emelian at the helm and Theodore Wickham, recalled from Bath with some ceremony, back at his desk in the estate office. Mrs. Odette Vrain was given a position in Arabella's own household, a good one, with adequate salary, and a room that faced the garden. Margaret Holden was thanked with a letter that she read 4 times and kept in her coat pocket for a year. Harold Penfold was paid and given the genuine, lasting gratitude of a woman who did not give gratitude lightly, and Lady Seraphine Dallow's name appeared once more in the London papers, briefly, in a legal notice, before disappearing entirely into the ordinary silence of people who have been accurately seen and have chosen wisely to become invisible. The first time London understood that something irreversible had happened was at the Caldwell Christmas masquerade. The same ballroom glittered beneath the same chandeliers. The same marble staircase rose beneath 300 watching faces, but this time, when Duke Emelian Crest entered, he did not stand above the room broken and pleading. He descended the stairs with measured steps, his coat immaculate, his cravat perfectly tied, and the crest signet ring restored to his right hand. Whispers followed him, soft as silk dragged over stone. They stopped only when he reached the east archway, where Duchess Arabella Voss stood in a gown the color of winter sky. He bowed to her, in full view of everyone, not the shallow bow of polite acquaintance, but a deep, deliberate acknowledgment that made the oldest dowager in the room lower her opera glasses and forget to pretend she was not staring. "Your Grace," Emelian said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearest circle to hear, "I believe I owe you the first dance I was too frightened to ask for last autumn." The room went still in the exact way it had gone still on the night he screamed her name. Only this time, no one was hungry for humiliation. They were witnessing its answer. Arabella looked at his offered hand, then at his face. There was no desperation in him now, no performance, only the same serious boy who had once climbed her garden wall, asking without demanding, waiting without fear. She placed her gloved hand in his. "Then do try not to step on my hem," she said. He laughed, and the sound moved through the room like a window opening. The violins began, the chandeliers burned, no one screamed, no one needed saving. And as Arabella stepped into the waltz, calm beneath the eyes of London, she understood that victory was not always a public ruin or a dramatic confession. Sometimes it was a man reclaiming his own name. Sometimes it was a woman refusing to be frightened back into silence. Sometimes it was a room that had once watched you break, now watching you live. Duchess Arabella Voss turned beneath the candlelight in a gown the color of winter sky. Not black this time, not gray, and watched the room with the calm, unhurried gaze of a woman who knows exactly what she is looking for, and this time already knows she has found it.